Thank you all for being here. Today I wanted to look at personality a bit extended from the typology idea. So you're probably very familiar or somewhat familiar with the idea of introversion, extraversion, thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. I'm going to start with a review of those topics just to get on the same page, and then lean into how does this dovetail into these Jungian ideas of personality development when it comes to ego, shadow, anima, animus, and self, and kind of build a map of how we can look at the attitudes of extroversion, introversion, and the functions, but include also this sort of evolution of personality where we're the ego, but we expand to integrate some of our shadow as we talk about shadow work, and then expanding that into the anima animus aspect of integration, which is kind of a later stage, second half of life type of integration, and then even wider into the ego's relationship to the capital S self. So I will do my best. It's a lot of material, but the good news is if we want to do more of it, we can pick it back up next month. So let's see how I get this going onto my oh, interesting. It's not letting me do the very simple screen share that it normally lets me do. Let me try this one more time. Screen share. There we go. Okay. I was inspired by David's PowerPoint last week, and so I'm going to follow that way, and it helped me kind of coalesce my thoughts as well. So hopefully this will be work in the name of clarity as we go. But the title is Beyond Typology: Understanding the Personality Theory of Carl Jung. To start, most of you, this is going to be very much just repeating what you already know, but he was born in Switzerland, 1975, raised in the countryside by his pastor father and spiritual but outwardly Christian mother. She was his maternal side of the family had a strong connection to spiritualism and nature, and even if you've followed his career, his dissertation on the on mediumship and occult phenomena, I think was born out of his mother side of the family, that sort of spiritualism and that sort of mediumship. So that's why I say she was spiritual but outwardly Christian. He realized early in his life that he had two sides to his personality, what he later called personality number one and number two. I guess that's probably worth fixing. Interestingly, he didn't come up with this as a child. These exact terms, he came up with them when he was writing his autobiography. It's transcribed by Ennio Jeffe. But as a kid, he did recognize he was simultaneously this child that was quite small and the product of a time and place where he was. And simultaneously, he had this sense of himself as being much larger in a larger story, perhaps tied to the 18th century in a way he didn't quite understand. And so there was this early sense that there were two aspects to him, number one, number two. That's important because later we're going to talk about this in relationship to like number one as ego and number two as capital S self. So even though he didn't have those terms as a child, he was beginning to feel that distinction. He wound up going into psychiatry. Everybody was surprised when he decided to become a psychiatrist because psychiatry was not particularly well developed or well respected at that time. We're talking about like the end of the 19th, the end of the oh, I did that. That's why I was confused there too. This is the end of the 19th century, and psychiatry was just beginning. It was not considered really much of a medical science yet. But as he was considering what to do with his career, he wanted to be an archaeologist, didn't have the money for it, was looking at being a medical doctor or a surgeon, but then took this left turn into psychiatry, and it was because he read this book, the Kraft-Ebing's book on psychiatry, that was one of the psychiatry textbooks of that time. And he read in the very beginning, that it is probably due to the peculiarity of the subject, meaning psychiatry, and its incomplete state of development, that psychiatric textbooks are stamped with a more or less subjective character. And that psychoses are a disease of the personality. And then we hear in this passage Jung's response when he read this as an adolescent. My heart suddenly began to pound. It had become clear to me in a flash of illumination that for me, the only possible goal was psychiatry. Here alone, the two currents of my interest could flow together and in a united stream dig their own bed. The two streams for him were the biological side of reality and the spiritual, immaterial side of reality. Later in his writings, he speaks of the psyche-matter dichotomy, or the spirit instinct / matter dichotomy. And here you get a sense of that. He was already interested in those two realms as an adolescent, but wasn't sure how they could come together in any sort of rigorous professional scientific way. And he felt that psychiatry was the way that they could come together. It's also worth pointing out that the textbooks being stamped with a more or less subjective character is very interesting. He comes up with a later idea of the subjective, well, what does he call it? The personal equation. And this is really important for extroversion and introversion, which we're going to get to. This idea that there is a personal equation. In other words, when you are looking at the psyche, or psychology in general, or philosophy, you are going to bring your own personal equation into that inquiry. You're going to bring your typological proclivities. You're going to bring your complexed proclivities. You're going to bring all of your personal and personality influences into the investigation itself. So I can see this really ringing with him, that psychiatric textbooks are stamped by the subjective character. Not only does Jung talk about the personal equation, at one point he describes writing about psychology as truly being a subjective confession, which is really just an extension of this idea. When you're writing about psychology, secretly, according to Jung, you are also subjectively confessing your perspective by what you put in the foreground, what you put in the background, what you omit, your organizational perspective on the ideas of psychology is going to betray your own proclivities. And he found that immediately in the field of psychiatry. I'm going to not go too much into his biography, but it's worth noting that for our discussion today, he did become was mentored by Freud. They came together because Jung was doing work on complexes, and in the word association test, which some of you may have heard of, basically the word association test, if you haven't heard of it, it's 100 words that they put together very purposefully. Some of them are pretty unloaded words that would not evoke strong emotions. Table, things like that. Wind, you sort of wouldn't think too much about it. And then other ones are meant to evoke strong emotions if you have a strong association to them, like knife or attack, or these kinds of words, or money, or mother, or whatever the case may be. If your psyche has a strong complex association to that particular word, it shows up on the test by reaction time, or your inability to recall your associations later. It's a whole system of thought, but basically Jung was on the pioneering side of that work. And when Freud published the interpretation of dreams, Jung reached out to him and sent him his own work on complexes, and the two of them, began a friendship and then a mentorship. But it turned out that they went different ways because their perspectives were different, and Freud was very attached to his psychoanalytic ideas, and there wasn't room to hold Jung's emergent ideas about things, especially the collective unconscious, relevance of mythology, etc. And so they split. We've talked about that in 52 Living Ideas before in terms of that rift, and what precipitated the Red Book essentially was that sort of Jung's being shunned from the psychoanalytic community because his ideas no longer meshed with Freud, and particularly after the publication of Symbols of Transformation. But the reason I included Adler here is because after that split, it happened before the split, but Adler had previously been a mentee of Freud's and also been separated from Freud. And so there was a pattern here. It wasn't the first time that this had happened in Freud's camp. And Jung started to ask the question, what is happening here? Why are these multiple people, let's just take Freud and Jung and Adler as examples right now, why are we all trying to understand the unconscious? We're all looking at the unconscious together, and we're all seeing different things. We're all reaching different conclusions. We're emphasizing different things. We're omitting different things. It goes back to this idea right here of the personal equation, the subjective confession, the subjective character. So Freud had a certain disposition, a certain personality that he was using to investigate the psyche, and particularly the unconscious. Adler as well, and Jung as well. And while they had all wound up in the psychoanalytic camp under Freud, Adler and Jung had reached points where they disagreed and therefore been sort of excommunicated in a way, not to sound histrionic. But in the case of Adler, the rift was that Freud was on the side of really the unconscious being organized around sexuality and aggression, whereas Adler really saw the unconscious being organized around the inferiority complex and elements related to the birth order. And so essentially, that was the rift before Jung. And Jung's example, which I should have put here, is, Jung was interested in mythology and the occult, because for Jung, if the psyche experiences something, that becomes real because the psyche experienced it. So in that sense, whether it's fantasy or whether it's a dream or what have you, the experience of the psychic experience of something, the phenomenological reality of psychic experience is what gives weight to reality, not just external reality only. And so Jung thought that mythology was, and religion were, expressing very important aspects of the psyche. He was sort of adding the religious dimension of the psyche and the archetypal dimension of the psyche, and Freud was not about that. So whereas Adler separated from Freud because of this sort of inferiority side of things, Jung separated from Freud because of the religious and the archetypal side of things. And after Jung split with Freud, like I was saying before, he was deepening his understanding of the personal equation, or how one's disposition or temperament can affect their worldview or relationships, really. Whatever, I can just do it by words, but they can affect their worldview and relationships. And so the concept of extroversion, that helped Jung understand Freud. And these are excerpts from Psychological Types, from Collected Work 6, that extroversion is defined as an outward turning of libido, a positive movement of subjective interest towards the object. So in that sense, the subject is the individual and the object is the other, right? So if I'm here with Shrikant, for me, I'm the subject and Shrikant is the object. For Shrikant experience, his experience, he is the subject and I am the object, right? So the positive movement from me to other is the extroverted flow. It's probably worth adding that libido here just means an energy, psychic energy, which could be interest or attention. So the natural interest, the natural attention is flowing from me towards the other, towards Shrikant, towards the other person. Yeah, it's a transfer of interest from the subject to the object. It's active when it is intentional and passive when the object compels it. So active extroversion would be with sort of a conscious component that I'm paying attention to the other or to the world, something external to me, and I'm emphasizing it. My attention is turning towards something other than me externally, and I'm choosing to do that. It's not something that is possessing me or fascinating me out of my range of control. For example, recently I got a little drum set, something I've always wanted to do, and it wasn't under compulsion that I bought this particular little electronic drum kit. It was something I've always wanted, and the time it was ripe for me to do it. So I bought it, and I choose sometimes to play it and have a relationship with it. And it's really wonderful. But it's different when the object compels you, which means that it's not under choice. It's not under volition. One is compelled towards the object. It could be a television figure, a politician, a frenemy, but that whatever that object is, if my attention and interest are compelled towards it, I have no choice in the matter. I'm just along for the ride. That's passive extroversion. And when extroversion is habitual, we talk about the extroverted type. So when the movement from subject to object is primary and regular, that's what we mean by an extroverted type. Introversion, on the other hand, helps Jung understand himself and Adler. It's essentially functionally the opposite of extroversion, which makes a lot of sense. Jung talks very much about the tension of the opposites. So here we have the inward turning of psychic energy, of attention and interest. In that sense, it's a negative relationship of subject to object. So with me and Shrikant as an example, rather than my attention and interest flowing naturally towards Shrikant, what's going to happen is what happens in the sphere of relationship is going to be flowing inwards, right? Like my interest withdraws from Shrikant and actually moves towards the subject, me, my own subjective reactions, my own experience, my own ideas in relation to being in a relationship with Shrikant. So the emphasis is in me, not in the object. In that sense, the subject is of primary importance and the object is secondary. And in introversion, it's active when it's voluntary. So when I voluntarily shut myself off from the object, and passive when I'm unable to restore to the object the libido streaming back from it. Yeah, this is the way that Jung writes in ways that are, at some point I've got to write something that clarifies, because he's says a lot of really wonderful things, but he says them in language that's not always accessible. And here he's saying, like, there is the possibility of being actively introverted. So if I want to just be in my internal state, let's say I want to meditate, for example, and I want to go inwards, it would be a voluntary activity to choose to meditate and kind of be not present necessarily. Like if it's an eye closed meditation and I'm going inwards, in that sense, I'm voluntarily shutting myself out from the objects around me, people and things. But when I'm unable to return the libido, the psychic energy that a person is aiming at me, then it becomes passive. So that's to say, if basically if I'm unable to work reciprocally, right, relationally with another person, they're turning their attention and interest towards me. If I'm unable to flow back towards them in interest and attention, and genuine interest and attention, not just superficial, but actually be interested and curious about the other person, that's where there's it's active when it's happening purposefully. If they give me attention, or if the world's giving me attention and I can receive it, but I can't reciprocate, let's say I just sort of am protected from any sort of reciprocity or relational intimacy, then even if people turn their attention, interest towards me, I can't really return it, because I'm too in myself. I'm too walled off. I'm too in my subjective experience that I can't put too much of my psychic energy towards the other. So that would be a passive form of introversion. Just like when overly being attentive to the outer objects, right? Being almost possessively attending to others and objects would be a sort of passive version of extroversion. Not being able to relate to others and being too much inwards would be the passive version of introversion. Just so quickly, the four functions. I love the way that Jung makes this simple in part of his writing. Sensation just tells us that something is there. It's a perception function. Jung calls it an irrational function. Tells us that something is there. That's it. Through your physical senses, you recognize something that's there. Couldn't be any one of your senses. Could be your eyes, smell, ears, whatever it is, but you recognize something is there. Thinking, which is a rational function, which is a rational function, tells us what that thing is. It's how we categorize. It's sort of the function of categorizing. Actually, that would be a really good thing to add there. It's just sort of the categorization function. You kind of know what something is. You give it a category. It has a name. It has a word. It has a concept that allows you to take the something that you encounter and give it a category, make it a thing. Feeling, which Jung also called the valuation function. In one of his seminars, he says it could have just as well been called the valuation function. And I kind of wish it were, because feeling has all these other implications for most people. But in any case, feeling, the valuation function, tells us what the value of the thing is, which is like whether it's agreeable or not, whether we accept it, whether we reject it. And it also kind of gives us like a hierarchical dimension of valuation. So you say some things are more important than other things. Some people are more important than other things. How you track things in terms of their value, that's the feeling function. For example, in terms of thinking versus feeling, Jung gives this example at some point of like the idea of studying the louse. What is that? Entomology, or studying insects. This would not be something that a feeling function person would probably do, because let's say he's comparing the importance of the value of freedom and the studying of the louse, right? So if you look at studying an insect versus being a person whose life is about freedom or political activism or something like that. Studying the louse, you would have to be probably somebody who's very detail oriented and could choose a career that could make money, and you could do, and you could find all kinds of details and categorizations of breaking down the insect, learning about the insect. But when you compare like studying a louse to something like equal rights or freedom or freedom of speech or whatever, you can kind of see, well, like probably the other one would be, in terms of valuation, it would have more value for most people. Most people would find more value in something like free speech than they would in, hey, tell me more about how the insect works, right? So that in that sense, you get a little bit of a picture there. Like thinking can really break things down and explain things. Feeling kind of puts things in a value order, and you kind of say what's more important than what else. And then lastly, intuition is perception via the unconscious. So this is a form of perception distinct from sensory perception. That's why we often think about it as like an ESP, or you have dreams where you see something that doesn't make sense in terms of normal senses, right? Like you dream something and then it happens, or you dream of something happening in your friend's life, and the next day you realize it actually did happen, right? So it's almost like an extrasensory form of perception, I might call it. Jung is a little bit unclear about this function, but I actually think it's very, very rich, and it's almost like the archetypal side of perception, right? Because in sensation, we get to know the world around us. We get to know like the physical manifest reality. But intuition gives us, I think, some sort of access to the archetypal. So this sensation may give us access to the world around us, and intuition more gives us access to what I would call the archetypal side of reality. Like a compass, Jung saw the functions as an orientational tool to help him understand both himself and others, and to help others understand each other, like married couples in his practice, and like him when it came to Freud and Adler and so on. And like a compass, this is an image from his Tavistock lectures, and I really like this because it shows both. Nobody's a pure type, right? So nobody's all intuition, nobody's all thinking, all feeling, all sensation. It's sort of part of the personality development is to develop your functions, right? You start with a superior function, and the superior auxiliary, and then a tertiary or an inferior auxiliary, and then an inferior function. But nobody's all one thing. I'll show you an image later from von Franz that'll make that more clear. But I love this image because, like the compass image, you can see the 4 directions in the sense of like, okay, intuition, north, sensation south, thinking west, feeling east. I'm using that purely metaphorically. They're not correlated with the directions, but you can see how there's those 4. But you can also see how the superior function and auxiliary function combine to create different personality types. So if you're an intuitive thinking type, you're talking about speculative thinking, right? Or if you're a thinking intuitive type, it's kind of speculative. It's more abstract. It's more about the future possibilities. It's more speculative. If you're a thinking type, but your sensation function is secondary, it's more empirical thinking. So this is going to be more like about like natural science or biology or something that's going to be a little bit more connected to physical reality as opposed to speculative reality. In the same breath, if you go over to feeling, if your second function is intuition, it's going to be intuitive feeling. So your sense of perception about the future or things that could be or things that are possible, and what could be that's the most important thing that could be. What would be the best value of the future that could come into fruition? That would be this sort of intuitive feeling. But if you're a feeling type with the sensation as the secondary, it's more emotional feeling. It's more connected to the body. It's more systematic. It's more, or I shouldn't say systematic, more structured, usually a little more conservative, a little more structured. You're talking about being not in the realm of possibility and speculation, but more in feeling and experience. Along with your evaluation of what's important and what you turn your attention towards. So you get a little bit of these little added elements give you actually a clearer picture of how people work, because a lot of when we meet someone else, very often they are kind of in this space between 2 functions. They might have a primary and a secondary, but you kind of get the sense of if they're a thinking type, they're going to be more speculative thinking or they're going to be more empirical thinking. If they're feeling type, they're going to be more intuitive feeling or more emotional feeling. And I like how that kind of rounds out the 4 functions there. So let's talk about function development. I wanted to find a beach ball image, but this will work fine. This is from Jung's. This is from Collected Works 18. It's also the Tavistock Lectures. Here we're still with this compass image, but he's made a division in this image where the unconscious is striped. You can see that, and the conscious is clear. So imagine this is a beach ball with the 4 primary colors, right? Often I associate thinking with blue, intuition with yellow, feeling with red, and sensation with green. But in any case, let's say all these functions have their own color of this beach ball, right? And let's say where the line is the ocean, right? So this is how I see the development of typology, and actually it's very in line with von Franz's idea, which I think is more complicated, more difficult to imagine. But imagine this is the beach ball, and we're talking about emerging, our personality is emerging from a state of unconsciousness, a state of symbiosis with the mother, a state of undifferentiatedness. We have no sense of self and other. We have no sense of inside and outside. We have no sense of fantasy and reality. Life is kind of in that hazy womb state. That's what it's like to be under the water, right? And so imagine the whole beach ball is under the water. What happens is first, let's just follow this person's typology. Thinking, one function would emerge first, right? So here, if you can imagine, like from the ball coming up, a little bit like this tip of thinking comes out, right? You get a little bit of a thinking function, and maybe it's even sort of starts like a light bulb. It's up and then goes down, up and go down, but eventually it's going to take hold, right? And this part of the ball is going to be above water. You can just imagine moving the whole circle down, and about here is the water level. So we have a sense of our thinking function. Okay, our primary function is coming out of the water. It's starting to develop. It's starting to differentiate. Then a second or auxiliary function would develop too. So along with the thinking, one of these sides is going to come out. Let's say intuition comes out. So we're kind of here, and then we kind of go like this, right? Like this part of the ball comes out of the water. So it's a little weird to show. That's why I wish I had the ball images of the beach ball, but you can start to see now we're here, right? Now we're the thinking, intuition, right? We've started. First we were just here. Now we've got this. So there's a little bit of thinking, and there's some intuition. That's going to be your secondary development. And that's actually a lot for a lot of, that's the first half of life enough, and a lot of people could even stop at that point or do stop at that point. But for the individuation process, let's say those that are going into the unconscious, differentiating more of their personality, there's another step. Now we go to the third function, right? And that would be almost exactly what this image is. So you can see, like, we have our sensation, intuition, and thinking somewhat developed, with mostly the thinking developed, but some intuition and now some sensation too. But what's not developed, the inferior function, which is always the opposite of the superior function. So we may have three functions now starting to be developed, but one is still not touched on. That's the feeling function. And the really high level Jungian work, as I understand it, is when we actually can raise the ball up even higher to the, who knows how high it can go, but let's say we get so that the water level's down here. Hopefully you can see my mouse, where it's like the feeling edge will always be underwater. We'll never disconnect from it, and from a Jungian sense of personality development, but we can emerge a lot of personality. So there is this sense of the potential to rise this ball up. First one function, second function, third function, and then still we can integrate some of or become related to some of the inferior function, but it'll never come out of the water from a Jungian framework. And I just like that image of the beach ball. You can kind of see it, right? Whatever type you are, and then you kind of turn it a little bit more. That's your auxiliary, and then you turn it back, and you go even more, and that's your tertiary, and then you rise it up a little bit more, and that's when you build a relationship to your inferior function. But the inferior function, very importantly, always makes the bridge to the unconscious, right? So one can say that this is von Franz here from her lectures on Jung's typology. One can say that the inferior function always makes to the unconscious. It is always directed towards the unconscious and symbolic world. So there's no way to be fully differentiated of your unconsciousness. You will always have a point that's connected underwater, so to speak. It's always a little bit slippery and a little bit unknown. And von Franz would say the inferior function will always make that bridge. This is her diagram, different from Jung's and my beach ball sort of example. I think this is more complicated, but I'll read it. When the functions develop in the field of consciousness, she has A, B, C, D, the four functions. There comes up first from below one side, right? So we just did that. Let's say it's the thinking function in A. That'd be like the thinking part of the beach ball coming out. And then slowly another function appears, right? So that would be probably B, intuition as we did it, and then slowly, and then under favorable positions, and then they all appear in the field of consciousness under favorable positions. That would be this kind of image where the four of them are elevated. That's her counterpoint to my example of this, but being like the ocean and a beach ball. But this is reading further in her text here. One cannot bring up the fourth function because it insists on remaining below. It is contaminated with the unconscious and remains in that condition. Trying to fish it out would be like trying to bring up the whole collective unconscious, which is touching on the archetypal pieces we're going to get to. And it's something one can just cannot do. The fish would be too big for the rod. Jung has a famous quote, one should never haul a fish that's larger than one's boat. It's too big. One can't fish up the entirety of the collective unconscious. So what can one do? Cut it off again? That would be a regression, right? If you just sort of, if you split it off from oneself. But if you don't give in, there's only one other alternative. The fish will pull you into the water. Okay, so this is von Franz is bringing up a more complex idea. Let's say we come up, get this up a little bit. There's an equal movement going this way for the thinking, for the feeling function to come up, so to speak. my thinking function has to go down. I have to sacrifice. I have to let go of my superior function enough. I have to be vulnerable enough to, in my superior function, to disconnect from it and allow the lesser developed functions, especially the inferior function, to come up. But what von Franz is saying, that means it's going to pull you down. So your convictions, your strengths, your perspective is going to have to descend. And she describes it, at this moment comes the great conflict, which means for the thinking type, the sacrificium of his feeling. I'm sorry, which means for the thinking type, for instance, the famous sacrificium intellectus, which means you're sacrificing your intellect to allow that experience. Or for the feeling type, the sacrifice of feeling. So it's having the humility to go down with one's other functions to that lower level to meet it. And that produces a stage between the two layers at about the level where everything is neither thinking nor feeling, nor intuition, nor sensation, nor intuition. It's kind of this middle space, right? Where I'm circling on the compass, like where all the points meet. There's no one thing. It's all exists kind of together there. And from that space, something new comes up. Namely a completely different and new attitude towards life. And here's the key phrase, in which one uses all and none of the functions all the time. So from that descent, it's almost like first one has to emerge, as we saw with the beach ball. But then if we really want to develop our personality, actually there's a descent that happens. We actually sort of have to sacrifice our old attitude, our old understanding, our habitual understanding, in such a way that we can get in touch with the undeveloped stuff, especially the inferior function, because that's where we connect to the deepest layers of the unconscious. And by doing that, what emerges is a new attitude towards life, in which we have a more differentiated relationship to our functions. We can use all of them, we can use none of them. We know the right situation to pull out our feeling function, which if this was a thinking type, we would formerly not have been able to do. We know the right situation to bring out our sensation function, our intuition function, and we know how to not bring any of them out at any time. It's within the jurisdiction of choice and ego. And that's a very high level personality development from a Jungian framework. But this is all still within the functions, right? So let's take it a little bit into the archetypal here. But first, key takeaways. So the functions do have a correct order of being assimilated: superior, auxiliary, tertiary, and then inferior. So there is a correct way of doing that. If you try to jump, let's say you do superior and auxiliary, let's say you're a thinking type and you have your intuition going, and you try to jump right into feeling, that's when you have the two big fish that von Franz was describing. That's when you can't take that onto your boat yet. The thinking, you need to have a strong enough structured personality that you can sustain the descent into the unconscious. And so to do that, von Franz is claiming you need to go tertiary first. So you would need some sensation before you sort of dive into the deep end. If you try to go from 1 or 2 straight into 4, you're kind of talking about swimming with the sharks. You're talking about you're in the wild. You don't have the right boat for that yet. You can't haul that quite yet. So there is a correct order of function development. The inferior function maintains our connection to the unconscious. So there's no point in time where your inferior function is developed enough that you disconnect from the unconscious. It'll always keep your feet wet. It'll always keep you connected to the unconscious psyche, particularly the collective unconscious. Okay, so here's the archetypal side of the personality. This is another image from Jung, also from the Tavistock lectures. You can see what's interesting here, I think, right away, is that the ego is not centered, right? The circle for the individual is actually what's at the center. The ego is kind of off center. I'll read these things over here on the left in a second, but just to stick with the image, we can kind of see how this model of Jung divides the conscious and the unconscious, because we have the ego with the subjective personality. We have, which is just living in the field of consciousness. We have the persona, which is the mask that faces the world. And then we have the external objects. So earlier when we were talking about extroversion, here's where other people are, right? So now we can see how the ego relates to the external world. It goes from ego through the mask of persona into the external objects. Notably, persona is the Latin word for mask. I think it's Latin. it might be Greek. Unfortunately, I'm blanking, but Jung makes a very interesting points about that the persona functions like a mask, like from Greek tragedies, to project the role. So in other words, you use it to make the intended impression. You wear the right outfit, you talk the right way, you get the right credentials. And so that mask allows you to make the impression you want onto the world, onto the external objects, and simultaneously conceal some of the truth behind the mask. So the mask only it has an impressionable side and an invisible side, and that's all related to the persona. And then you have the individual at the center, which is not the ego. This is personality number 2, like we were talking about at the beginning. This is the self, which we haven't talked about yet, but this is the real individual, the real total center of the total personality. And and on the other side of that, we get into the unconscious, right? So we have the first layer of the shadow, the first layer of the objective personality, which is correlated with the ego. I like to think of the shadow. If you think about the moon, right? Like the moon's a great image for me when I think of the shadow. It's like you have the visible side and the dark side, right? So the part that's visible that you know about yourself is the ego. The part that's related to what you know about yourself but invisible, that's the shadow. And then you have the anima animus is the inner corollary to the persona. So whereas the persona is the function of relationship to the outer world, the anima and the animus are the function of relationship to your deeper layers of your unconscious. The anima and animus function as psychopomps or mediators between the ego and the collective unconscious. So it's a really important function of internal relationship. It's what ushers us into relationship with the self. And interestingly, it's kind of like typology, right? Like there's also a correct stage here. So you first have to have some ego. It's imperative that the first half of life, you develop some ego with some persona, some identity, some sense of self, some consistency, some establishment in the world and the external. You have some kind of role. A lot of times people have families. A lot of times people have their own, they're established in the world. That's imperative. But then there's the very Jungian process of individuation where, okay, this is who I thought I was. What's really, what's happening in my shadow? That's like the second function in a way of the archetypal. I'm drawing a corollary there, but it's metaphorical. But like, just like you'd have the second function, you would have the shadow, right? And you got to start with the shadow. It's the closest to your consciousness, and that's where you got to start. And then the third would be the anima or the animus. The anima is the feminine side of a man's psychology, and the animus is the masculine side of a woman's psychology. I recognize that that's a little more traditional in thought, but that was Jung's point. And that would be like the third function, right? So like just like the third function, we need these mediators in our psyche. We need to have a development. We need to have a relationship to the contrasexual in ourselves, because that's what's going to take us into the capital S self. That's what's going to forge our wider development. And no steps can be skipped there, just like typology. Got to start with the ego, got to go to the shadow, got to go to the anima animus, and then to the self, right? If we were to say I'm in the ego and I really want to, let's say I'm a man and I really want to function on my relationship to my anima, and I haven't done any shadow work, it's not going to work. It's just not going to work because and I've seen this actually with people, even people I've worked with, that you got to go to the shadow first. It widens your boat, just like the auxiliary function, right? It widens your consciousness and allows for a relationship to the anima and animus, which is actually a very difficult stage of development. Jung says, doing the shadow work is a big task, but anybody who does some integration of the anima or animus should have Esquire at the beginning of their name, because that's how serious of work it is. It requires serious work, and you really would need some shadow integration to get there. And then with relationship to the animus, that's where you get into the self. So in terms of what I've written here, just to define these different images that we got the ego, which is the center of the field of consciousness. Here's the field of consciousness. Here's the ego. The shadow is the personal unconscious, complement to the ego. So if I am this, I am not this. If I'm a polite person, I'm not a rude person. If I'm a good person, I'm a good-looking person, I'm not an ugly person. If I'm a smart person, I'm not a dumb person, right? The shadow is going to complement or compensate what I believe about myself in the ego. Okay. And then the anima animus is the soul. It translates, this I know is Latin, it translates to anima is soul and animus is spirit, the functions that bridge the ego to the capital S self. Just a quick fun aside here. I remember learning that the word psyche, that's the word that Jung uses for the total personality, over and over again. I used to think psyche was a strange word. Why would we be talking about psyche? We could talk about the personality, or there's other words. Actually, if you look up the etymology of psyche, it's quite wonderful. It actually implies mind, but it also has correlations or implies the word soul and the word spirit. So in the word psyche itself is a lot of what Jung's psychology is about. He did a lot of work on psyche versus matter, the psychological versus the material world. And psyche really does. I was kind of shocked to find psyche actually encapsulates a lot of the content that you would find in the unconscious, including soul and spirit. And then the self, which is here, really, it's the individual. He doesn't make that clear, but that's what that is. It's the superordinate center and the circumference of the total personality. So it's the second center along with the ego. And it's the circumference that includes both the consciousness and the unconscious. So that's Jung's image there from the 1925 lecture he gave, Introduction to Jungian Psychology. The implication is that there are two centers in the personality. You know, there's our egoic, the center of the field of consciousness, and the center of the total personality. So that is huge, a huge implication. I like to use this analogy. Hopefully this helps you too visually. It's like the solar system has the earth and the sun. The personality has the ego and the self. So once again, you see how the one center is offset, just like the ego is a little offset here in his image. The earth is not the center, right? In the solar system, the sun is. And the self, as a metaphor, would work as the center of the personality, just like the sun, but it would also be the circumference, right? So it would be like the orbit of Neptune as well as the sun itself. That's the self, the center, and it encapsulates the total. But to be in touch with the self is the relativization of the position of the ego, right? If I think I'm the center, if I become aware of this center, I realize, I'm not the center of the world I thought I was, right? That can be. Jung says that an encounter with the self is always a defeat for the ego. And actually, if you think about the Copernican revolution, like that's another reason I like the solar system analogy. Think of the upheaval that took place when we moved from a geocentric to a heliocentric model, right? We used to think we were the center, and it was a God-given center, and it was quite religious. And people were killed at the idea that perhaps the center, the sun is the center of what we know of the universe around us. And that was a real upheaval to make that paradigm shift. But that's what we're doing with our personality. This is what we're doing with our personality when we go in the process of individuation, is a relativization of the ego, is what Jung says. It's the same for the personality. I'm going to start winding down, I think. I've only got a couple more slides here. Edward Edinger has an idea about this too. What's interesting is I'm giving you high level stuff. Perhaps next month, if people are interested in the idea, along with questions, we can discuss if you want to go deeper into this in more specifics. I'm kind of giving like the theoretical framework, but we could talk more about like, how does the anima show up? How does the animus show up? How does the shadow show up? Because they do show up in relationship and in fantasy and in dreams. And we could get into some of the groundedness of what this looks like. But I did want to give a theoretical model like typology, but with the archetypal piece here as well. So Edward Edinger, who was a Jungian analyst, has a version of this idea. It's called the ego-self axis. This is a page from his book. And you can see that originally the ego is contained in the self. So this is like our model here. Imagine the whole ball is under the water. So the potential of the individual is completely underwater. It's submerged. It's symbiotic, right? Then it starts to come up. So this would be like a first a superior function, for example. There's a sense of personality, of ego, of conscious awareness that emerges from the Ouroboros, the the symbiotic relationship with the mother and with fantasy and such things. And then you get the secondary and tertiary functions, so to speak. And now we really have a relationship with the self, so to speak. And then we have a deeper emergence of the ego, but it never loses contact, right? This is like von Fraun's idea that inferior function always keeps us connected to the archetypal. We never disconnect, but a lot of the process is emerging as an ego, as a personality, and forging a relationship with the self. Like I say here, originally the ego is contained in the self but undifferentiated. Then the ego emerges. It's almost like the development of consciousness, really. If you look at this like phylogenetically in terms of the history of the species, we're kind of talking about the development of consciousness, but that we recapitulate in our own individual lives as well. But then the ego emerges like the beach ball, and then finally the ego is distinct from the self, but still in relationship to it. So this is where we have a relationship with our ground of being. The original origins of life itself, or of our existence, but we're not subsumed by it. We're not identified with it. We're not split off from it. We're in relationship with it, and that relationship functions as the ego self axis in Edinger's lexicon, and it's opposed to the symbiotic relationship of the ego and the self. So I'm going to leave you with this thought to tie the two things that we talked about together, right? We got the ego, we got the shadow, which is the same sex part of the psyche, anima animus, which is the opposite sex part of the psyche, and the self, which are the 4 steps, like typology. But I'm going to do it like this. I like how Edinger talks about the spiral, right? That there's this cyclic process of the ego emerging from the self. And then there's sort of like it's basically like a pulse, like a rhythm, like we emerge and we kind of become union. And then we emerge and we become union. It's almost like a rhythmic separation and regression, right? And I'm sure we've all had moments like that where we sort of feel like we're more independent or when we're more sort of regressed. But he uses the term spiral to express this process, and so does Jung. So you'll have to use your imagination here with me because I didn't get this slide done. But let's say we're going to go through it one more time with types, but also thinking about the archetypal part of the personality we just discussed. Let's say these are the 4 functions, but instead of being like the lines, they're the actual quadrants, right? So let's say this is the upper right is thinking, lower right is intuition, lower left is feeling, and upper left is sensation. So here comes my ego. Okay. Imagine this is the ground of being. This is actually like von Franz's picture, right? We're talking about the ground of being from which one's personality emerges. It's the potential of all things, but it's the non-manifestation of all things. Okay. So here we are in our ground of being, and we start to emerge. Here comes the beach ball out of the water. Now we've got a little bit of a thinking function. We start to categorize things. We start to make sense of what the world is around us, right? And as we spiral, we get a little bit of shadow. We start to widen our scope and see the way that we're more than we thought that we were. And this would probably include some spiraling into these secondary and tertiary functions, right? So it's sort of a spiraling, but we're still not connected to this is the self, right, of the total personality. We're widening, but we're still not in contact. We haven't quite made this bridge. So what would do that? We're spiraling into sensation, we're spiraling into intuition. As we widen it, it's the anima animus that gives us a link. It's that anima animus that gives us a link to that center. We don't have it at first. At first, we have an ego. We have a secondary function, a tertiary function. We can use that to bring in some of our shadow. We probably have done some of that if we've developed those 3 functions. But the next step is, because I'm kind of spiraling like this, right? I'm just spiraling on the upper right corner. The next step is to get over here. That's the anima animus. That's the contrasexual. Now we're starting to touch on the inferior function over here. This true ground, the maintenance of the ground of the unconscious and the scope of the unconscious, the depth of the unconscious. The anima animus takes us there, and as we spiral more and wider, we get a wider platform to exist in. We never quite cover the inferior function, but that gives you a sense of the spiraling. Ego, secondary function, tertiary function, shadow, anima, animus gets us into that fourth quadrant of inferior. That's a really difficult jump. I don't want to understate that. That's like getting across enemy lines. I mean, that's really like serious work. But if we do that, we've got a foothold. We've got a foothold on our other center, what Jung calls the midpoint of the personality, who we really are, as distinct from our egoic identifications. And once we have that link through the anima animus, as we forge that relationship, as we relativize the ego, the great irony is actually we're expanding our field of consciousness, but it's not egoic. It's the process of who you really are. It's the process of becoming, the acorn and the oak tree. And for anybody here who's interested in the Jungian idea of self-realization, I will add that, again, like the Freud break, like the Jung and Freud break, what Jung, I believe, really adds to the conversation of personal development is the importance of this sort of spiritual piece. It's the importance of the archetypal. It's the dimension that formerly would have been called religion or spirituality or heaven, and sort of taking the stance of how do we, in modern times, how do we maintain that instinct for religion, that capacity for spirituality, when it's kind of fallen apart at the collective level, generally speaking. I know 52 Living Ideas is doing a lot of that work as well. Thank goodness, to explore that, and that's part of this link, right? Getting from the ego to what's going on over there. What's the bigger picture that I'm a part of? What's the solar system, right? And then developing that relationship in such a way that you have more of that, of the religious aspect of life, the spiritual side of life, in your total personality, in your conscious awareness. Jung said that for most of his clients in the second half of life, something like 2/3 of them, it wasn't really a mental problem, so to speak. It was that they were neurotic because they didn't have a spiritual attitude, and they didn't have a connection to that sort of fourth quadrant, to that sort of inferior, to that groundness of being, and that sort of that spiritual framework. And he said, every time when they found a spiritual attitude, that was their cure. That was their cure. So part of the Jungian course of self-realization includes some spiritual wrestling and a relativization of the ego into the capital S self, and what's on the other side of that. So I'll leave it there. If we pick this back up next month, we can go into a little bit more of how these different functions or archetypes show up in the personality. But I hope that gives you a lot to sit with, and I'm excited to hear questions, such things. So Shrikant, maybe I'll hand it back to you. Can you unmute yourself? Here, I guess ask you to unmute.
Okay, all right, thank you. Thank you, Aiden. So I have a bunch of questions for you, and then we can go ahead and get questions from everybody. So
Cool.
firstly, I want to tell you that this is a very, very good presentation.
Thank you.
What it did was that it actually connected two different things. So, see, what happens is that what I found is that Jung is a truly deep integrative thinker.
Mm.
And the way in which he puts things together is so deep and so intertwined. And he has that ability of, whenever he's looking at one thing, he's always cognizant of how it is connected to other things, how it moves from one things to other, how it relates to other things, how it dialogues with other things. And that is how he thinks. And that's what makes his work difficult to understand in the modern world, because modern world, we tend to be analytical. We say it is this or it is this. Tell me what it is. I will chop it up this way. But his whole purpose of self, the core idea here is that of the self, is that all of these are part of you, and they are dialoguing with each other. And if you just get focused on one, you're going to miss all the others. And in that sense, you're not being yourself, you're undercutting yourself. Now, unfortunately, what I found is that most of the people who come after Jung have that modern penchant for dividing things. So even when they're talking about Jung, they will divide things up in a way. And so it was really wonderful to see all these diagrams of Jung and of von Franz, because they show the integrity. And the thing that I particularly liked about your presentation is that in addition to looking at, thinking, feeling, intuition, and sensation, you related it to the concept of ego and self, this dance between the conscious and the unconscious. And that is the dynamic of what is going on. You can simply say that, oh, I think a lot, or I focus on feeling a lot, but that is not you. And you have to kind of understand the other parts of you and how they interact with one another. And it's a process of growth. So all those diagrams show that Jung truly has a very exalted view of what human beings are naturally. And he thinks that most of us have kind of lost our way in some ways by just focusing on this one thing. There is this feedback loop in the society for us on those functions where we are strong at, and in the process lose the connections with other functions. And this is very much related to an individual's relationship to other people, because if you do that to yourself, you will end up doing that to your interaction with other people too. You will be able to see only those part of people that you yourself are familiar with, and not be able to see the other parts. I mean, actually, the other person is a tremendous gift to you, because in another person, you will be able to see something that is in yourself, but you couldn't see directly because your focus is elsewhere. And because their focus is on what you are not focused on, and you can see it manifested in them, you are able to do that. So it's both a part of personal growth, individual growth, and social growth, and both of them are intertwined. And all of this actually is very spiritual. In base. I hear about exactly the same things when I'm going through the Bhagavad Gita, or when I'm looking at the New Testament, or implicitly that is what is being said in Tao Te Ching as well. And that is what Jung is really talking about. And unfortunately, many people who come after him are trying to take those spiritual elements out and trying to just show you what you can easily see and perceive. So in a sense, it is a way of kind of moving towards sensation versus intuition. He's a very deeply intuitive thinker, and he's saying that intuition is a part of you. That's where you're getting a lot from the unconscious, because you are kind of are aware of this entire network of factors that are very much real and are conditioning what you're doing. Yes, you can see the figure, but there is this entire ground behind it. So in Gestalt, it is the focus on the figure versus the ground. And the ground is large. It is large. And you ignore it to your own peril, because the new things that are going to come into the focal awareness are going to come from the ground. So I thought that you did a very good job with the help of Jung's diagrams to show the dynamic nature of personality. So any thoughts?
Yeah, that was great. I got excited listening to you. Got just sort of your excitement and the dots that you're connecting and related to the presentation as well. maybe I'll just speak briefly to the points that you brought up, and then take more questions from you or from the group. Yeah, the focusing on one thing, I really liked how you brought that up. And what it made me realize is, right, these we're talking about functions. So in other words, the challenge is not identifying with a function. If I see the world through a lens of thinking, um, what I'm basically doing is imposing a function of thinking onto the world, and identifying. So if I'm a thinking type, if I identify with my thinking, truly, like you say, that's what I'm going to see in others. That's what I'm going to see in the world. That's what I'm going to recognize. And an important part of that is very often people who carry the opposite. So in this case, feeling, because I've devalued feeling in my psyche, I will devalue feeling in you. So exactly what you said, Shrikant. Let's say I'm bringing thinking to the table, and I encounter somebody who's bringing a lot of feeling to the table. Together, we have a lot we're bringing a lot to the table. But the general tendency, unfortunately, is I'm going to devalue your feeling because I think thinking is what's really life is about, and you're going to devalue my thinking because you think feelings what's really about, and we miss each other instead of complement each other. So when you say we have a lot to learn from each other, I was really moved by that. I think that that's absolutely spot on, um, and that taking the spirituality out can be a big part of post Jungian or neo Jungian culture. Um, but I love the use of intuition as that's sort of the place where we can reconnect. I just think that's right. I think I'll just add this on the topic. Like, to me, sensation and intuition are really correlated to like instinct and spirit, or world and mind, right? Or like basically like the profane world and the spiritual worlds, like sensation and intuition. Because from sensation, almost like Kundalini, right, or something like that. It's like you get the rising up of the of from below, and you get this sort of the body oriented relationship to the world, the sensate experience of the world that's present and related to the world around you. Meanwhile, from above, from the archetypal or the spiritual side, is the descent of something spiritual that has its own order and its own revelations and its own shapings. Like you said something, Shrikant, about how this intuitive side of the world is shaping our experience. And I think that's exactly right. I think that's what the archetypal side is. Like von Franz talks about fairy tales as the anatomy of the psyche. It's the anatomy of the psyche because it represents the impersonal, non-worldly energies and dynamics and relationships in the psyche. That's intuition. Nobody has, if you think about fairy tales, the things that happen, the magic that happens, the talking to animals that happens, the strange ordering of the old kingdom and the new kingdom, this is not from sensory experience. We don't have this. This doesn't come from our bodily experience of the world, but it comes from somewhere. So that's intuition. That's the archetypal nature. And von Franz would go so far as to say, actually, if you look at fairy tales, you're mapping the anatomy of the psyche, of the intuitive side of the psyche. There's a lot there, and it's for sure influencing our experience. Yeah, but
I
you said a lot of great stuff. I don't know what else to say.
I want to make one more point here. I'm going to because what I want to do is I want to just talk about, it's, over the past 2 years, I've been looking at these spiritual traditions. I'm new to them, so my understanding is very limited. But I can see that there is a level of integration in these spiritual traditions, which is actually far deeper than Jung. So, for example, I'm going to use some of the church fathers. For example, Gregory of Nazianzus, he says that word is related, to, there is the mind and there is a word. Okay. So the Father is related to the Son as mind is to a word. So just like a word captures this entire intuition of the mind into a definite word in your mind, that suddenly concentrates all the light of the mind, all the connections, all the intuitive things are being brought together into this gem of a word. Okay, so that is the relationship between the father and the son. So it's mostly kind of intuition and thinking. Now here we're talking about logos, which the standard for thinking, whatever people call thinking here, we call is very low as compared to what is demanded here. It is saying, look for the seed that is going to produce everything. When you have that seed spoken in your mind, that is the word. Okay, so that, and then there is the spirit, which is basically your heart. And you're saying that, you know, your heart will be where your treasure is. So this is actually valuation. It's like, what do you value? It's like, what do you think you should be paying attention to? So that is the idea of the Holy Spirit. So you have got the valuation, which is the Holy Spirit. You've got the word, but you have to realize that the standard here is much, 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 much higher than how people think about thinking. The word, the logos, idea of logos is far more elevated than the idea of thinking. The idea of Holy Spirit is far more elevated than just valuing. I think valuing is a much, 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 much better word than feeling, because that's what, you know, what really matters to you. That's what the focus is. And that's what and then, so there are these three things. And what is the fourth? The fourth is incarnation. It is, you know, making into material all of these things. One theme that you talked about of descent of the higher into the lower. That's what incarnation is. So make into matter the deepest of your intuitions through the use of the word by the motivation of the spirit. So you can see in this thinking, it's all four together. If you have a part, you have nothing. So yes, you know, you can say I'm focused on this or stuff, but you're basically missing the whole. The whole is basically the incarnate one that descends, and it is a descent. You know, it is the higher lowering itself because of their love for the lower. So it is that axis, the primary axis of the primary function and the inferior function. There is this love between them, and that movement, and it's a movement up and down continuously. And the side functions are actually is like the hands, you know, it's like head and foot being guided by right hand and left hand. And all four together, if you have that, you have a human being. Otherwise, you don't have a self. You don't have an I. To say I means to have all four together. And the thing is that each of them love each other so much that they pour themselves out. So the intuition is all focused on the word. The word is all focused on the intuition. The word is fully focused on the spirit. Spirit is fully focused on the intuition. And each of them has the same feeling towards the incarnation, or, you know, of the body itself. So there is this continuous spiral of energy going through all four of them. Now that is the view of these early church fathers. And they say, if you have that, then you're human. That's what it means to be human. That is the view. And Jung comes closest, but he's not at this level. But the integration here is at it's a much deeper level. But Jung is the best thing we have in psychology who captures it and who's trying to get at it. What do you think?
Yeah, I love that. You know, I think there's a lot in what you just said. I really am enjoying the dialogue of bringing a spiritual um, uh, component to the foreground, even as we're talking about typology, because to me they're also connected. And you're also bringing up this wonderful archetype of the quaternity, which is such a Jungian, for Jung, like the number 4 was the number of totality, right? So like we talked about the cardinal directions before, the 4 elements, the 4 evangelists. There's this interesting recurrence of the number 4 as a way of looking at totality, and you spoke to that, and the spiritual side of what can be from Jung or from other perspectives. I think that what I would add to what you said, Shrikant, is what I've learned from typology, as it connects to these deeper layers, is that we will bring our subjective confessions, like I said with Jung, right? So as you subjectively confess quite beautifully, your excitement about it, I think I would guess you're a thinking intuitive type. Is that right? Like an NT of some kind?
Yes, I would say.
Okay, so see, both intuition and thinking exist in the realm of the ethereal. Thought is immaterial. Intuition is immaterial.
I don't know. I'm very like many people who are really good at typing
Yeah.
have given me different types, so I don't know for
Okay,
sure.
well, follow
And
my
I
thread.
don't.
Maybe it won't be about you
Yeah.
as much, but I'm using this as like like a launching point. This is where it's sort of like to me, so you have perception. Imagine the quaternities again. If
Hmm.
it's like intuition and sensation we talked about as
Yeah.
being related, and you were
Hmm.
talking about that too. So those are the functions of perception. One perception of the world, one perception of the archetypal aspect. Then the rational functions in the right column would be thinking and feeling. Um, when I kind of picture these, it's like the intuition and sensation. If we're born in that sort of symbiotic, right? Like the well, I'll just go very, very quickly back to well, whatever. The Edinger piece where we saw the ego was in the self, right? The ego was inside of the self, and then it kind of was born, and then it was separate. So same. So um, it has sensation and archetype have to be separated, um, and then it allows for the rational functions. If there's no separation of imagination and experience, or, subjectivity, of object and subject, if there's no separation of the sort of interior and exterior, how can you have consciousness? It's just um, there's no psychic dimension. It's just sort of instinct. But this allows for some reflection, this separation of sensation and intuition, and then it allows for what we experience as humans, this deepened sense of the feeling and the thinking function. So to me, the quadrants are kind of like this, right? And this is the descent, and this is the ascent. But interestingly, to me, the thinking and intuition are more about the ethereal and the mind, as you can see with thought, right? It's more about the abstract, and intuition is more about the revelation, the sort of the descent of the above, whereas sensation is more about like the from the below, the experience from the below, and feeling is also more of an embodied eros counterpoint to the logos. So why do I say that? Somebody who has like NT as their type is going to be more about the ethereal, and somebody who has SF is going to be more about the material consciously, the actual embodied material world. So what I would say is more and more I try to see the holistic points of view in the sense that all of those they coexist. So not only is there the descent of the spiritual, that would be like in the Christian perspective, which you mentioned, it would be like the salvation of the material, the soul of the material individual through spirit, or something like that. Versus there's the in alchemy, there's the redemption of spirit through matter. So there's not only a redemption of soul and matter through spirit in the Christian perspective, but alchemy has that other side of how do you redeem spirit and matter. In other words, spirit can be seen as located in the world around us, in the manifest world around us, and there are ways to redeem spirit in its matter state. Um, uh, but that's the alchemical process of from the below to the above, whereas the Christian really is more from the above to the below. That's why it is kind of patriarchal, and emphasizes the spiritual and emphasizes the heavenly, maybe not the original church fathers, but as I know it, versus alchemy kind of has this more matter-oriented dynamic. Von Franz said that if we could find a new Christianity that incorporated alchemy, we would really have something special, because we would have not just the realm of spirit as primary and matter as secondary, which would be valuing the mind and devaluing the world side of things. And we would have not only the sort of the materialist view and the embodied sort of view at the expense of the spiritual, right? The utilitarian atheist perspective, but we would have a sort of a meeting of both realms. And von Franz said a new Christianity that involves alchemy. I also like Abraham Herschel's idea of
Let me just, I have to interject here.
yeah.
So firstly, this is actually the old Christianity. So for example, I'm studying Athanasius on the incarnation. He's like 380, who is the founder. He's like a core person who built up, kind of Christian doctrine. He's probably the most influential. And he, this the key statement in that, and I'm doing the meetup, by the way, on Sunday at 2 p.m. Eastern time. I'm starting a series on that. So if you're interested, folks, please join. His statement is, God became man, so man could become God. Okay, so you can see here, both those directions are there. It's like the cross is not one way. It is descent, going down into Hades, fixing all the problems, and then resurrecting and ascending, and then the Pentecost, which goes sideways. So it is the descent and ascent together. It's like one movement. So that is the old Christianity. And it is true that, later Christianity kind of just focused on that, yeah, it's the up, which is important, and it kind of devalues the lower. But the old Christianity, including the scriptures, are basically God so loved the world. And so there is a tremendous value placed on the world because it is seen as creation of the original, principle through which it is, you're seeing the creation in action. So there is that in the old. And so what von Franz is looking for in the new Christianity is actually there in the old Christianity. We just have lost it. That's it.
It could be. Yeah.
Yeah. Wonderful. Shall we get other people in the conversation?
Yeah.
All right, folks, go ahead and type an exclamation mark if you'd like to make any comments or have any questions.
Kimberly wrote something. People, if you have any questions or anything came up, comments, yeah, feel free to type your exclamation point or raise your hand. I'm just reading here in the chat. Kimberly had a question earlier about dreams, if they only occur when you go into the inferior. So maybe I'll address that quickly. Dreams are not specific to the inferior function, as I understand it. I do a lot of dream work with people, and it's largely from a Jungian lens, but also a little more embodied. And dreams are the unconscious. So, in other words, the unconscious includes the inferior, but the inferior is not the only dimension of the unconscious. So that would be like in dreams, you would encounter that sort of spiraling thing like that I did abstractly on the graph. Very often, first it's your personal unconscious, which is much closer to your ego than the inferior function. And then you would so you deal with things that deal with your upbringing. So like early life situations, usually parental complexes, core beliefs that are affected by your upbringing, circumstances. That would be first. That's not your inferior function, that's your shadow. And then your contrasexual, the anima animus, is usually next. Once you've done some shadow work, you start to deal with the contrasexual, or the relationship between your feminine, the side of your personality, and your masculine side of your personality, developing that relationship. And then the self, which holds the whole thing together. And the self is where you get into the inferior. So what I would say is, dream work is not about the inferior function. It may include some of the inferior, but what it is about is the unconscious in general. And sticking to our sort of discussion today, it also has this sort of progressive element, right? You start with the shadow, which will show up in dreams, usually the same sex figures. Often they're chasing you, often they're breaking into your house, often they're kind of shady figures in your dream, same sex. Then you get into this stuff. Once you've done that, contrasexual, often it's romantic, often it's fascinating, often you get these figures that represent very big energies for you. And then you get into the self, which is, a whole other thing. So um, punchline, dreams are the unconscious in general. The only thing I would add is Jung's pretty clear from his framework, since this is a Jungian thing. When we dream something, it's because something is unconscious. So there's no impetus for dreams, according to Jung, if we're just dreaming about what we already know. And that's really valuable in terms of dreams being the unconscious, because if you dream something and you say, oh, I dreamed that, it means this, right? If you jump to a quick conscious awareness, you've probably missed it, or I've probably missed it when I do that. The whole point of the dream is to oh, I need to let people unmute. The whole point of the dream is to highlight something that's not conscious, and that would be what a dream would do. It looks at the unconscious, including the inferior function, but not only. And how do I do that? Shrikant, are people raising their hands? I should go back to gallery view, maybe. It doesn't look like it, but feel free to jump in, guys. I mean, if there's something you'd like to see, hear more about, if you have a question about something. Okay, I'm going to make Shrikant host here. Hang on one second. He's going to keep it flowing smoothly. And then comments. Oh, it looks like Judy's got her hand raised, Shrikant.
Let's go with Judy, then Paul. Folks, don't be shy. Would love to hear what you thought. This is a great presentation. Go ahead, Judy.
Hi, Aiden. Thank you for this presentation. It's really wonderful. I would like to learn more about the application of all this. More than, I mean, I love the theory, and we can go on forever on the theory. But I was wondering if maybe in future classes that you're going to offer, are you going to be like looking at applications, and also of every one of them, like just what you just said about the dream, for example, is an application that I would like to explore more. The Myers-Briggs also, I would like for you to maybe address that issue if you're going to follow up. Not today, not necessarily today, but more on the J and the P part. How Jung saw it, if he did see it at all, I'm not sure. I'm a Myers-Briggs certified instructor, and I did it for many years, but always applying it to businesses and groups. So I would like to learn more about how is it currently, all these intuitions and sensations, and how is this being applied today in different areas of the world.
That's cool. Thanks, Judy.
Mm,
I didn't know you were MBTI certified. I'm MBIT certified too, although I don't do a whole lot with it currently. But
yeah,
it's kind of fun, the tools you have
it
access to
is.
from
It's a lot of
certification.
fun.
Yeah.
I enjoyed it a lot.
Yeah, but I think thank you for your feedback. I would like to lean more into the practical application, so maybe we'll do that next month, the practical side of it. As quickly to your Myers-Briggs question, it's based on as you know, like it's Myers-Briggs is based on Jung's typology theory, but Jung, it also extends it. In other words, it also takes liberties. Like for Jung, there was 8 types, right? There's like the 4 functions and the 2 attitudes. So it amounts to 8 types. Whereas whatever, Kathleen Briggs and Isabel Myers or something like that, they made it into 16 because they added the judgment or perception part on the end. I would say I don't know. I am not yet convinced that that's related to what Jung was talking about. Certainly, it's somewhat rooted in Jung, but I do think they extended it in terms of practical application today. One of the very interesting things about Jung's view is how much it emphasizes the individual. So in that sense, it's kind of far away from corporate aims or you know, he said somewhere like personality development is sort of like, it's not what you get paid for, right? So when we're talking about developing spiritually or to become more whole, it's a lot about the quality of our life and our self-awareness more than, usually speaking, like corporate aims or bottom lines or a lot of things where Myers-Briggs has found themselves into like management or
Hmm.
corporate settings. So Jung would lean more into the spiritual side, I think a little bit more into the personal development, but at the individual level. But I think it's great to have tools any tools that help us understand each other, and whether you're
Hmm.
colleagues or friends or partners. And Myers-Briggs is one of them, I think. Um,
We once did a typology of Jung, the group, and we found out that he was an INTP.
oh yeah, yeah.
We answered it as like if he would have answered it. It was a lot of fun. It was a
That's
lot of
cool.
fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, see, that's a good example because he was definitely some kind of thinking intuitive type or intuitive thinking type, but PT or whether it's P or
T
J, I don't know.
TP. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. Because
He always kept asking questions.
one of the implications of MBTI is that the auxiliary function is the opposite attitude of the superior function. So if you're an introverted thinking type, then you would be your intuition, your sensation would be extroverted, right? But I'm not sure that Jung, he does say that somewhere that the auxiliary is usually the opposite. I don't know though. I'm not convinced that that is a generalizable perspective. Um, yeah, obviously you need to have a little bit of both, but I'm not yet sure that I've seen that always the auxiliary is the opposite of the superior, or that that needs to be generalized. I'm not sure.
Thank
But
you
that, yeah,
for what is it's worth. I mean, I'm a big fan of just the raw cognitive functions of Jung. I think there is a website called Keys to Cognition, where you can measure um, the strengths of each of the functions. And what I found is that actually a lot of my friends, they are like, when you look at the functions, it could be like INTP or INTJ. And it's just a question of relative importance of it. But to see the strengths of all the functions, I think gives you a much more nuanced picture of what people are and what they're doing.
that's related to Dario Nardi, right? Shrikant, is that Dario Nardi's
Yes,
thing?
I
Yeah,
think
yeah. He's got some cool stuff like mapping typology onto brain activity and individual functions, like you're saying. It's really cool.
excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Judy. Next up is Paul. Paul, what do you think?
I I think it's. I mean, you might remember in last month, I think it was, I was saying because of all this talk about how hard it is to understand Jung, like how do you bring it out to a place where people can make it accessible? But I want to say you're the answer to that question because of the way you present it. You like make it accessible. So I want to congratulate you to that. But my question is, I want to hear how you would respond if to my points about how a Jungian therapist might criticize some current techniques, just very briefly, like that from this lens, it seems like other therapies that have emerged since Jung, Shrikant will like this because I was always trying to argue against him about this, but they seem kind of weak because they're focusing in one area and assuming everyone works best. Cognitive behavioral therapy. Let's approach it through the cognitions of the mind. There's a whole new fad of somatic experiencing. Let's approach it through how the body feels. So, am I understanding that a Jungian therapist would say, that's all well and good, but we're going to do this in this order where we're going to do things like that, maybe, but we're going to start with your primary function. I'm trying to see if I understood what you said. And then your secondary, and then your tertiary, and then your inferior, and relate that to the unconscious. So we might use various different methods along the way as we hit each of your three functions, but we have to do it in a certain order. I'm sanity checking if that's what you said, and if I'm making sense about how a Jungian therapist actually works.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for your question and thanks for your encouraging comment. I really, really appreciate that. That's my heart and hope, is that it's to take this stuff and make it more accessible, because I've studied it for, I don't know, 14 years, and that's been a frustration for me, is how inaccessible it can be, or unrelatable, when in fact it's and even Jung's language and sometimes the way he writes supports that. It's difficult to understand, and it's quite dense. One thing I do want to show you, since you talked about it, the 8 keys of self-leadership. I think it's the 8 keys, because Shrikant was bringing up Dario Nardi. This is more related to the where he ties it into neuroscience of personality. But the 8 keys of self-leadership. This is a very practical book. So why do I bring this up? It literally tells you, it's the 8 keys, because he's talking about the 8 introverted thinking, extroverted thinking, introverted feeling, extroverted feeling, introverted sensation, and so on. So you have the 8 keys. And what you can do is there's exercises in each of those. Let's say you're a sensation, an introverted sensation type, and you've developed some of your feeling, and you want to develop some of your thinking. It literally has exercises like to do journaling and to practice thinking, extroverted thinking and introverted thinking. So you can actually, whether or not I necessarily would support all of his exercises here, I love that he approached it that way, like to find ways to lean into the function that you want to be playing in, like the von Franz image, right? Like getting into that ground where you can kind of play a little bit so, but the question is, how do you do it? And this book, 8 Keys of Self-Leadership, I think is one type of solution. Like you just lean into those functions and find exercises or activities that would do that. So for example, if you want to develop your thinking, like reading philosophy, that's just a very quick example. If you want to develop your feeling, work on aesthetics, art appreciation, or you could work on hosting, right? Like hosting people and creating an atmosphere in your home, and hosting events. If you want to work on your intuition, try. There's websites where you can guess. There's like oh, what is it? I forget what the website is, but there's a famous ESP institute, and you can go on there and take their tests, psychic tests, where you guess what the next card is going to be or what the next shape is going to be. You just practice guessing what's coming next, or there'll be an image that shows up, but it's invisible, and there's 4 pictures underneath, and you have to pick which of the 4 the image is. Or less than an ESP sense, you could practice your intuition in terms of reading mystical experiences, right? So like people who are mystics, or capturing your dreams more often. That's a very intuitive, writing your dreams and your fantasies. And if you want sensation, do things related to your body, like any kinds of activity. It could be tasting foods, but very intentionally, right? So you're going to have a food, but really chew and really taste everything that happens as it happens. Spend time engaging with the world in a new way, but in a tactile, sensory way. Could be yoga, absolutely. Could be yoga. Could be working with clay, but your sensory. You could be aromatherapy, but you're engaging your senses. So that's just a short brief thing. You kind of say, so that's my response to part of your question. In terms of applying it to Jungian psychology, I think that the typology part would be in the background. I think a lot of it is like, it's more of the spiraling. So you use dreams, you use typology, you use active imagination, which we didn't touch on today, but active imagination is like the objectification of the psyche. So it could be drawing dreams, dialoguing with characters from dreams. You're basically concretizing images that come from the internal, from the psyche, and you're concretizing them and objectifying them and relating to them. You're bringing them into the world. And Jung did this with like his Tower and Bollingen and his structures of stone. He was bringing something from inside of his psyche and manifesting it concretely. And his experience was that both that depressurizes the psyche by allowing contents that are inside out, and it helps you in your relationship to your psyche by manifesting it, because it's in front of you now. It's not just in your imagination. So you have active imagination, typology, and dream work. And in all of those, you're kind of looking at where the ego is in relationship to the self, like the Edinger. You're sort of seeing like how much of the ego development has happened already, which you can apply typology to. You can apply the ego, shadow, anima, animus, self, where they are on that trajectory. Is the work right now shadow work? For most of us, when we go into therapy, it's shadow work. The shadow is about the personal unconscious. So we're going to be going into therapy talking about wounds from our childhood, like our relationships with our significant others, with our troubles we're having at work, and the way that that's connected to early patterns and developmental traumas. So that's going to be the shadow. It's the personal unconscious. Then we go into the anima. So, but once we do that, it's basically widening the ego. It's almost like, the von Franz's metaphor of we're fishing contents from the unconscious. So we have a bigger boat now. So now we can go deeper into the unconscious. That's when we start going into the contrasexual, right? The parts of ourselves that haven't developed because we've developed as one particular gender identity, and also the importance of finding a relationship to, for me, like the feminine principle, right? Having a relationship to the feminine principle of life. And then into the self, which is, the larger self. Jung uses this is the last thing I'll say. Jung uses the yin yang symbol as a great depiction of this, because it shows the original state of undifferentiatedness. It's all held together. And you could also use it as a really as a model for like a really differentiated understanding of how the unconscious and consciousness have become separated, but maintaining a relationship. It's a really great image. It's like not really a mandala, but like an image of the masculine feminine principle, which is a lot of the Jungian work. So a lot of it is stadial, whether it's typological or whether it's like this shadow animus self thing, or whether it's the emergence of the ego from the unconscious. It's sort of the stadial piece, and all of that's happening in Jungian analysis. So it wouldn't necessarily be like, okay, let's work on your auxiliary function. That may be a component, but I personally wouldn't reduce Jungian analysis to that technique. That's just one particular way of looking at the development. That would be my
Beautiful answer. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Paul.
All right. Who would like to go next? Go ahead and type an exclamation mark or raise your hand in Zoom. I can talk to Aiden forever, so I can always
Mutual.
talk. But I want to give chance for others. Go ahead and type an exclamation mark or raise your hand in Zoom. The next point I wanted to highlight of what you focused on is the active versus passive.
Yeah.
I think that's a huge point. And people don't make that sharp distinction between them, between those two. And they have a very different impact, whether you're kind of just taking stuff in and it is impacting you. That impact is real, but you are passive. You're kind of just taking it in versus you actively engaging it, of saying kind of yes to it, Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because that's a very, very big distinction.
Yeah. No, I like that you pointed that out, and your sort of reflection of it too, that sort of active versus passive mode of being. And I think that it's really relevant because a lot of what we're talking about really in Jungian psychology is consciousness. And one of the ways that Jung talks about consciousness is differentiation. So when we talk about like developing the functions, we're talking about differentiating the functions, which means becoming more conscious. In other words, to be able to use them by choice, just like you said, saying yes to them, right? Which is very different than one feels possessed by them, right? Like thrust into a certain mode, right? If I'm constant, it's so interesting. Like, what I have found is, I almost think of like intuition and thinking as like masculine principled types, functions, and sensation and feeling as feminine principled functions. That's my personal idea. But like it helps me because I find that people who are really in the sensate kind of embodied world have compulsive thoughts. Jung talks about that as animus possession, right? Like opinions or thoughts that are like possessive. In other words, they're not thought through. They're not being said yes to. They're just like someone's possessed by the thought. It's like the thought, this is just the truth and that's just the way it is. And if you're wrong if you think otherwise, but there's no objective argument there. It's sort of like the embodied person experiences the masculine principle of life in a possessive way, and sometimes very darkly. I know a couple of women who like are very embodied, feeling types or whatever, and when they're getting in touch with their thoughts, their thinking shows up in dreams in like black birds or like descending negative objects, because that's how thoughts are. It's like they're not playful relatedness things. They're like obstructions or enemies or possessors. Meanwhile, people like me who are too much in the abstract and in the head, the body forges its attention through these kind of negative ways, or relationships through these negative ways, where I'll become absorbed by a frustration with a person, or my body will be it will cause a depression, or will slow me down because I need to be more descending, a person who's embodied and not just a brain on a stick. So for me, the body becomes imposes itself on me, or relationships impose themselves on me because I'm a thinking intuitive type. So in my experience, the two um, the part that you're not differentiated and that you're not conscious about, it doesn't go away. It just visits you by imposing itself on you, right? That's like what shadow is in a basic word, but like doesn't go away. It just comes through the back door, you know. And for people who are really heady, it comes through the body and relationships, and people who are very embodied, it comes through the head and spirituality. You know, I know a lot of yogic people, right, who get lost in sort of like guru trajectories because they find a teacher, but it's a can be a sort of projection of masculine authority, a masculine principle, and so that fills the void of the sort of embodied perspective, and vice versa. Men, for example, who get really carried away with anima figures, right? Like midlife crisis, they're willing to throw away their families and their wife and chase after a younger woman that embodies the ensouled, vitalizing part of life that they've lost. So these things, I think you said it perfectly, Shrikant. I'll kind of leave it with what you said. It's like, it's the capacity to say yes to something. If you don't have a choice to say yes or no, and you're just thrust towards something, or something is thrust upon you, that would be the passive version. And I believe that Jung's framework is saying to become more discerning in all of these ways, so that if we do, so we have the capacity to say yes or no, and it's not just thrust onto us.
Yeah, I mean, the thing I do love Jung, because I love the fact that he respects the unconscious and he respects the conscious, and he knows what they are, and you're saying you need both of them. You can't ignore your unconscious just because you can do something with the conscious, because then the entire power behind your conscious, you're leaving behind. At the same time, you can't, just because you respect this rich soil of your intuitions, you can't disrespect that consciousness, because that consciousness, when done right, it's a beautiful dance, because the conscious makes or manifests something in your mind what was there only implicitly. And having given birth to that utterance, now it has a power magnified, because it's suddenly, there are these light rays going into your subconscious, lighting up and connecting up all the things where they were just being hinted at. And at the same time, if you get locked into this one insight that you had 10 years ago or an hour ago, and if you get so locked into it that you're ignoring all these little inputs that keep coming from the subconscious, because there is no end to those, it's tremendously rich. So you have to respect the respect both of them. Again, your idea of descent, or the idea of kind of kenosis, that conscious should just give everything to the unconscious, and unconscious should give everything to the conscious. Instead of considering it as an opposite, consider it as yours, your own, and going back and forth between them, because that's the only way. And that is the idea of, as best as I understand it, of building up the self, because you're continuously going and not sticking to your ego or whatever it is that you have found out about yourself, being completely open to the unknown. It's a dance between the order and chaos. It is the dance between the known and the unknown. It is, you're continuously going between. Go ahead.
Oh, me?
Yeah.
Oh, well, yeah, I was just agreeing with you, but
Okay.
it made me think of the Edinger, like the cyclic, it's sort of like the ego self dance, right? When you sort of
Yes.
separates and then you return and you separate. And so it's like, I'll tell you the concepts that have really helped me with that most functionally are probably from Piaget, when he
Mhm.
talks about accommodation and assimilation. But it's basically like, once you have a paradigm, a mental framework of the world, and you get new information, it's like assimilation means you just map the new information onto what you already know. So in that sense, you're not really learning, you're just accumulating more of knowingness. Versus accommodation is you have to actually shift your he calls them schema, but like your paradigm or your internal working model of yourself or the world or others. And so when you receive new information, you don't just tack it onto what you already know or reject it outright. You take into account, well, hang on, like, if this is new information, what's how come my model is not able to acclimate to this, to accommodate this, or how do I have to change my understandings for this new information? And if you do that, it is a widening. It's very in tune with Jung, right? It's like, you're sort of widening the scope of your model. And again, with the spiraling, right? So we're moving from just an egoic perspective to a wider perspective, kind of like you were saying, including the shadow, and that dance of being willing to shift our position, but having a position, and it just gets wider and wider, ideally.
Okay, I want to throw in one more thing that I liked about what you said. I like the fact that you took those quadrants in the final diagram that you had, and then you made the quadrants the center, and you were talking about the quadrants, because I think that's a very fundamental difference. That's, I think, a more fundamental way of looking at it, because it's not a particular point, a line. It has its area, an area which is closer to one versus the other, and all of that is captured in the area much better. And then you're talking about the spiral movement, and that's exactly what is going on, because it's one being. We are one being, and all of this is us. So it's just a question of what are you focused on, and how are you moving through those things. And each of the movement that you make puts you in a different state. You keep on growing with each of those things. You touch upon something, you bring something to life. They are not just areas. These are living areas which are going to really turbocharge this or that. So just by passing through, for example, in the inferior quadrant, there is a lot of energy to be gained, a lot of release of unnecessary ossification in your main quadrant, because you're seeing something exactly opposite and you're kind of appreciating it. So let's see, especially the beach ball metaphor. Thank you, Marco. Yeah, that was very good.
That's cool. I'm glad that registered. That helps me to think of it that way, and that kind of speaks to the quadrant too, because the way the ball is in 4 shapes, right? So you can see, like, here's the thinking part and here's the sensation part and so on. You can kind of see the sections. One thing I would add, one final thought, if we're closing or if there's no more questions. I don't want to miss. I wish there were another attitude. Okay, I'll call on Bob in a second, but I do wish there was another attitude, rather than intuition and sorry, rather than introversion and extroversion only. In my experience, there tends to be a tendency towards an emphasis on the material, or a tendency towards emphasis on the spiritual. Over and over again, I see this in different personalities. And I think in some ways, like, the spiritual to me is what's encapsulated in the masculine principle, and the material is what's encapsulated in the feminine principle. Even the word matter has its root in mother, right? The Latin word for mother is the root of matter. And we always talk about, very often, at least in Western traditions, a lot of patriarchal perspective of gods, like the spirit, and logos, which are they're very masculine principled, perceptions. So as an antidote to that, I really appreciate, like, as we talk about the Christian mythos, like, in the one version of the Genesis, it's sort of like, in the beginning, God created heaven and the earth right away. We're talking about a distinction. We're talking about a spirit aspect. The first distinction is the realm of that spirit that I'm talking about, or the heaven, and the realm of material matter. And my point is, like the yin yang, that there has to be a correspondence. If matter doesn't exist, onto what is spirit going to, what formative influence is spirit going to have on? There's no clay, right? And if there's no spirit, then there's no meaning. It's just this arbitrary evolution of non-meaningness, or not having something transcendent, which has always given humans a cultural orientation. So I think together, it's like, what a beautiful pairing, right? And we've kind of become, in our Western ideology, so about the we've just lost that balance. I don't know how else to put it, right? It's like, and I see it in people too. That's my punchline. I wish we had this dialogue in an attitudinal sense, because very often someone who's overly spiritual would really would benefit by incorporating a more embodied, sensate, manifesting reality, whereas somebody who's too much in materialistic aims, or pleasure aims, would really benefit from having this sort of spiritual perspective. So the two are really important to me.
And let me make a quick comment, and then we'll go to Bob.
Yeah.
Folks, if you have questions, we're willing to. Eden, you're not in a particular hurry, right? If people have
I
questions.
can stay if people want to
Yeah.
keep going.
Okay. So one quick point is that, again, kind of looking at kind of older Christianity, or older actually version of both, the same thing with Hinduism. They are embodied religions. Like the way in which, for example, the older churches are, like, you can look at like the Orthodox churches. They, or even Catholic Church has this of, it is embodied, the liturgy is embodied. So there is music,
Yeah.
there is movement of body, there is incense, there is the concepts, there is the feelings, all of it are together. There is you as an individual, there is you as interacting with the group, and all of it is together. So the traditional, it's in the modern times that there is this split. between the spirit and the matter. So if you go further back, you can see that in Tao Te Ching, it's like, be like water, my friend. So you're just letting those principles flow through you. So excellent. Next up is going to be Bob, and then we'll take maybe one more question and then we'll wrap up. Bob, go ahead.
Hi, Aiden. I've been thinking a good deal. This is a comment that might relate to what you've been talking about. I've been thinking a good deal about what is the consciousness as opposed to how does it arise out of the unconscious? You did mention that intuition is a perception arising from the unconscious, if I have that correctly. But I think of the the unconscious, what's in our mind as being the whole world of our experience, and that's the ocean of our experience. But I think of consciousness of arising as a focus, F-O-C-U-S, out of this experience. And this focus could be any one of the four points of Jung, feeling, intuition, sensation, and thinking. I just want to emphasize the word that what consciousness is a kind of focus. And I wonder if you agree with that.
Yeah, I love that. Thanks, Bob. I can tell you've been thinking about it, and I bet we could have an interesting dialogue about that. I'm interested in that topic as well, and there seem to be different perspectives. I like your word focus. I sometimes think of the analogy of like a flashlight, right? So like, when a flashlight is in spread mode, there's the same amount of light emanating, but it's kind of like obscure. You can't see so well. It's dissipated light. So that's what I imagine as sort of the original state of consciousness, and the process of becoming like more attentionally focused, right? So more able to focus consciousness on things would be sort of that process of going into a tighter beam flashlight mode. And so I like that word focus. It makes me think of that analogy I've thought of as sort of like a visual picture of that, from a dissipated state to a more focused state. And I think even Jung would talk about like the dissociability of the psyche as being that sort of that state in which all things are they're not unified. They're just sort of a soup of human experience. I mean, I don't even know what you would call it, but it's not focused. It's all just sort of a haze. And we all kind of go through that, right? At some point, like around 12, or we have this moment where we kind of come into being. It's like we sort of like have our first like, oh, I'm an individual moment, like I exist kind of moment. It's like a focusing a moment. But as to the origin of consciousness, yeah, maybe that focus starts in one of the functions, like you're saying. Like maybe it's like that's where the focus starts and kind of spreads, like we were talking about. But yeah, go for it, Bob.
I would say that the focus could arise from anywhere. It could be a concentration of a kind of perception. I mean, it could arise from feeling or intuition, or it can arise from our motives, what we value. That would be feeling.
Yeah.
And let's see, did I leave anything out? Yeah. Well, I think I would. Okay, and I would call thinking. I know you called it as thinking is a form of categorization. To categorize is a more complicated process. That's why human beings can think. So I would say the focus could arise from any of these four features.
Yeah, that's a great point. I liked also the use of I think you brought light into it. Didn't you say something about light? Yes or no?
No, but that's a good analogy.
Oh, maybe you said focus, and I was thinking of the flashlight. But light is often used, like in Jungian theory, as a sort of representation of consciousness. Because if you think about it, like if you go back in history, you know, being in the night, you know, night is scary, right? Why is night scary? Because we can't see what's around us, you know, and the things that are in our psyche kind of come out and we can't really see what's really there. So there's this sort of state of unknowingness and mysterious sounds and undifferentiatedness. Whereas during the day, sun comes out, you can really see what's in front of you. You're aware of your environment, you're aware of your state. So light has this sort of conscious awareness corollary. But one of the things I like about the light analogy, which I guess I'm throwing now into the conversation, is the dual nature of it. I think it's so I think it's like it's so intuitively rich that we've come to a place where light has this dual wave theory where it's like that it can be seen as a particle, as matter, or as a wave, as a sort of immaterial entity, because that's exactly what I'm talking about. So in the process of consciousness, there's this process of the paradoxicality of the immaterial dimension and the material dimension, like we're talking about the heaven and earth, or the masculine and the feminine principle. And even light, which is a symbol of consciousness in Jungian thought, is rich with this paradoxicality of it represents both. So consciousness is this dual nature of matter and wave, and in terms of your idea of focus, or that it could emerge from anywhere, consciousness, I think it's a great point. I think it just leads to more questions, right? So is it just without solving the riddle tonight? The Jung piece would be adding a teleological dimension. So like, as opposed to a Darwinian version in which it just happens evolutionarily, that our focus just by nature of evolution suddenly reaches a certain critical mass of focus and tips us over the edge into consciousness. That would be more of a causal explanation for consciousness, whereas Jung difficultly, you know, it requires wrestling, but Jung seems to point to a teleological aspect of the human experience, which is to say it's not just being caused, it's also being pulled into. So that's interesting. So consciousness, if you have a teleological perspective, that's different than having only a causal perspective, and that's a piece of the equation too. Yeah, Bob.
Yeah, I agree with the first part where you talked about light. I think light is a strong example of a focus. When you have light, you can see it. It stands out. But there are other kinds of focus. For example, an iceberg floating in the ocean. Most of what goes on is 90% goes below the surface, but the top part, 10% will stand out, and you will see that's a kind of focus. As far as the teleological point that you made, that also stands out. It's yes, it's pulled from the but that comes from I think of it as coming from feeling. There's something that strongly draws you out, and it causes you to think of the long view, and that's another kind of focus. So
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Yeah, that's interesting. I love that topic, so I appreciate you bringing that into the mix. It's really it's an interesting one.
All right. So Aiden, this was wonderful. This is wonderful. And I think that the most useful thing for me, and for I think many people, is for you to kind of get something from Jung himself, or people like Juan Franz, because they have such deep insights, and like the most kind of quote unquote popular versions of it, of their core thoughts, are really quite poor in compare, like they don't have the richness, in trying to kind of dumb it down. I think they have lost some of this integrated nature of it. So thank you for bringing that, and I hope you keep bringing those kind of things in, and I'm really looking forward to this series.
Awesome. Thanks, Shrikant. Yeah, I guess I'll talk to you soon. We can see if we want to do like a more concretized version of this topic, or if we want to continue with this sort of Jung von Franz a different topic.
Just suggest 3 or 4 things to me, and
Okay.
we'll pick up from there.
Awesome. Thank you,
Alright,
Shrikant. Thank you,
thank
everyone.
you. Bye.